Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be going over how I personally set up my canary and finch cages. I'm going to try and make this succinct and easy to follow. Keep in mind that this is just how I personally prefer to keep my birds and set up their homes. So my minimum standard for width of a cage is at least 25 inches. There are certainly outstanding circumstances, such as sick birds, rescues, or otherwise, where they might end up in a smaller cage for a period of time. But if you really want your bird to be nice and healthy, to get the exercise it needs, then I recommend at least 25 inches. If you are able to, and you are only keeping a few birds, I would recommend at least 30 inches in that case. So when looking for your cage, you should be looking for a cage that has decent width as opposed to height. As well, the bars of the cage should not be any more than 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch. If it's any larger than that, a bird can get stuck or even fit between the bars and hurt themselves. The height of the cage is really a non-factor, but it should not be any shorter than at least 1.5 feet. Birds do get a minimal amount of exercise from flying slightly vertically, but for the most part, birds exercise by flying horizontally, left to right. When setting up your cage, you should be mindful of where you are placing your perches. Perches should be placed left to right in a similar fashion to the width of the cage. This is because, as I said, birds fly left to right. So the majority of their exercise is going to be had by flying the furthest length of the cage. You want to avoid putting your perches directly to the wall, however, as the bird needs enough space to both land and maneuver on the perch when it's flying around. You should have at your leftmost and rightmost space the perches placed as the highest perches in the cage. This is so that the birds, when getting their exercise, don't have to avoid other perches or objects in the center of the cage. And going into that, other perches may be placed down below in the center of the cage, but you should avoid hanging items from the top center of the cage, as that is where the majority of their exercise is going to be had, and so it should be kept free so that they're able to move around. Toys and items should be placed around the outside of the cage so you don't hinder their flight paths. So while the outermost perches should be placed the highest, they should not be placed within, I would say, about 4 to 5 inches of the very top of the cage. This is because oftentimes when birds are flying and landing on a perch, they'll see the ceiling out of the corner of their eye, and it'll cause them to flip their heads back and crane their heads back. A lot of people think there's something wrong with the bird, or that they're stargazing, or they're twirling or sick, but actually it can be a simple matter of the perches just being slightly too high and the bird is looking at it. If you find your bird is doing this, try lowering your perches first. Because of that, the topmost perches on the very outer edge of your cage should be about 5 inches from the top, and all the rest of your perches should be lower than that. You'll find that new birds will spend the majority of their time on the highest perches as opposed to the lowest perches as they get more comfortable in your home and in your space and in their own cages. They'll start to adventure more and even might spend some time on the ground of their cage, which is totally fine. Now, when purchasing your perches, I prefer to use what many standard hobbyists prefer to use, which are plastic perches designed for small birds like finches and canaries. I have a couple favorites that I will try and link below. But in addition to that, I will throw in a couple natural perches just so that we can keep the bird's feet nice and exercised and healthy. A misconception is that plastic perches are bad for your bird's feet. What is actually bad for your bird's feet are all the perches in the cages being the same perch. When your bird is sitting on a perch that is the same diameter all the way around and perfectly even, and all of the perches are the same, the pressure will always be on the same spot of the foot, which starts to cause pressure sores. So while using plastic perches, you can use several of the same type, but just make sure that there are other options and varieties for your bird to exercise their feet with. In terms of other items placed in the cage, I personally prefer to give my birds toys. I buy parakeet toys, small toys, colorful toys. It doesn't have to be anything complicated or too dynamic because the birds are small and they're not really able to tear or shred things very well. I find that my birds' favorite materials tend to be preening toys such as raffia tassels, loofahs, and then colorful pieces of other shreddable paper. If you find your bird is picking a lot at the bottom of the cage or on bars even, which I have one bar chewer, he's a little crazy, I will often let those birds out of the cage because they like to fly around, or I will give them more toy options, and usually that helps settle them down a little bit, especially for birds that are picking or plucking each other, which is really common in the case of canaries. Female canaries will pluck each other to use as nesting material. So I find a great way to remedy this is to just give them lots of toys and options. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about when setting up a cage is preferences for food bowls and how to feed your bird. As you can see in this video, I have a kind of silly little setup, and this is because all of my small birds are located in my bedroom, so I prefer to keep as much seed and material waste off the floor as possible. That being said, there is quite a bit of seed on the floor, as there always will be when keeping small birds such as these. My preferred type of feeder for my birds is a clean feeder. It has an open back where you pour the seed into, a very skinny small trough inside that the bird has to reach its head into, and then while the bird eats, it typically eats over a small grate where the shells of the seed falls into. This also helps to keep good seed and empty seed separate so that you can tell easily from a glance if there's food in their food bowl. It tends to be that if you just have a bowl with seed in it, the bird will eat it, and oftentimes it can either look full or you can end up wasting quite a bit of good seed because the shells are mixed in. Some other options are just blowing the shells off the top or rotating by flipping the food bowl. My recommendation is to place whatever feed container that you decide to have on the floor of your cage. This keeps majority mess inside the cage. I've gone a step further with my bowls, as you can tell, and I've put them in a type of Tupperware container with a small door opening, which my birds have learned to go in and out of to keep the majority of the food inside that Tupperware container. I've seen other people do things such as keeping them in a fishbowl or similar. Now keep in mind that both the clean feeder that I use and this Tupperware container that I use require the bird to learn to use them properly. Because of that, you should be careful when changing your feeders and drinkers, and make sure that you see your bird going in and out, or you have multiple birds and maybe one already knows how to use that feeder. You want to be careful because birds can be nervous about new items such as that, and they might not want to go inside, and so you don't want your bird to starve. Now, in terms of cleaning my cages, because I used mostly plastic perches, It's very easy for me to soak my perches when they get particularly dirty. In addition to that, I prefer not to use my grate, which comes in most cages as a grate. I don't really love the scrubbing aspect of things, especially when I have so many cages to keep. I place a layer of paper over the top of my grates, and whenever they need changing, which is usually every 1 to 3 days, especially dependent on how crowded your cage is and how big your cage is, and even weather, because humidity can make things a lot smellier and worse, I'll just roll up the paper and replace it, and it takes a couple minutes at most. So this is how I personally keep my cages for my finches and canaries. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave me a comment below and I'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. See you next time.